Welcome to Series 5 of the Lawyers Coach podcast. My name is Oliver Hansard, and each episode of this podcast will feature myself or Claire Rayson, both of us coaches and former lawyers, trying to find out what makes lawyers tick. In this series, we will be hearing from various guests and experts, exploring the skills that lawyers need to succeed. And then, at the end of each episode, we will both be reflecting on what they said. The Lawyers Coach podcast is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. In this episode of The Lawyers Coach, Claire Rayson speaks to Anna Lind, who's Head of Strategy and Business Transformation at RPC. They talk about how she works to drive change through her organisation and provide some tips and a model to help firms navigate change.
So Anna, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Claire. I'm delighted to be here.
So can we start off? We always try and find out a little bit about the journey that our guests have been on. So can you tell me a little bit about how you ended up where you currently are?
So I've spent my entire professional career working within and around professional services firms. So I've always done B2B programs, but actually after I got my business degree at university, I went into roles within marketing, business development, and client management. So not anything around, change management or project management. That's come later in my career. But I've spent time in big international global organizations in the property sector and in the legal sector, but also worked for small startups and sort of medium-sized firms where I am at the moment. So have seen how change and project delivery works in well-resourced, complex organizational structures, and then through to smaller organizations where perhaps you don't have specialists like myself or others in these sorts of roles. But in my time in marketing, business development, and client management, my first exposure to more traditional change management was when I was at JLL. I started there in 2014. And I came in and I set up and led their UK client relationship management program, which was the first time that they'd really delved into more professional client management activities. And it became apparent probably within about the first 6 months of my joining that organization that when we had the structures set up for the program, really it was massively around transitioning those behaviors. And that was when I really got interested in this concept of change management and transformational change. I left JLL in 2018 and I went to CAS, which is now Bayes Business School, and did my MBA. And in that time, I concentrated my studies on strategy and organizational behavior. I did my thesis ultimately on organizational culture. So I sort of got more into the academic side of change management. And then when I graduated, I was lucky enough to secure a role here at RPC, which was focusing more primarily on change management. So not what I would call the sort of traditional path into something like change management. But yeah, that's been my journey so far.
Fascinating. I'm going to come back to some of the things that you've mentioned there to think about how that might have impacted the role that you've got now. But before I do that, can you perhaps just tell us a little bit about your current role and what it entails?
Yeah, sure, that's no problem. So I'm actually in the process of transitioning positions from traditional change management into strategy and business transformation. But for the last 11 months, I've been at RPC. I've spent my time in the firm's project management office, where I've been supporting on a variety of projects and programs that's driving behavioral change through the organization here. Some of that's linked to IT systems implementation. We've done something around our use of the office, like most businesses in COVID times. We've looked at office refurbishment. I've been heavily involved in our approach and transition to hybrid working, which has been really interesting. And I'm looking at some of their client management models. But my sort of day-to-day focus in that change management capacity is on ensuring that employees and leaders within RPC have got the right knowledge, skills, and attitude to support these new ways of working. So lots of concentration on making sure that we have the right sponsors, we've got the right key stakeholders bought into what we're doing. We've got a vision for what we're trying to achieve, and we're clear on what the end result looks like and what we're trying to get to, and then really making sure that the business and the employees are aware of those changes. So heavy emphasis on communications, and also then working with the learning and development team to make sure that we're embedding the skills and the knowledge that the business needs to transition to whatever it is, that we're trying to transition them to. And in my new role, I'll be looking at setting up a team and a function that continues to support on change, but really is looking at more transformational programs. So taking it up to a bit of a higher level and linking that into the firm-wide strategy. So that's quite exciting as well.
Is your role and your team, is it one that people come to when there's a specific project and they recognise that it's a project that's going to have a big impact on the individuals and therefore they look for your support? Or is it broader than that? So recognising that there's constant change, particularly over the past 2 years, and therefore getting people ready for any change, whatever it might be?
I'd say it's more of the former than the latter. So in my new role that I'm moving into, or I'm in from the start of this year, so 13th day of this new position. But in that new role, it's really looking at what are our strategic priorities within the organization, and then what are the activities and the projects that help us to achieve those strategic priorities. And then linked to that, what's the change impact and what's the project delivery that we need to achieve in order to fulfill that strategy. So with that in mind, it tends to be that we have an idea of what the projects and the programs are that we want to deliver, and it's really ensuring that we've scoped them out properly. We're clear on the timing, we're clear on the resourcing, and we're clear on the business impact. And then what we'll need to have a look at is what other projects are going on. Are there things like dependencies? So if you look, for example, with IT systems, often in order to deliver a very big system like iManage, or moving across to something like Microsoft Teams, in the background, there's quite a lot of IT delivery work that will have needed to happen ahead of that. So you're looking at sort of the interrelationships with all these different projects. So I think it's the former, but I think what happens is as people get used to working through the lens of project management and change management, you're obviously educating the business as to what good project delivery looks like and what works when you're transitioning the business through a change lens as well. So they get used to the communications and they get used to the fact that they need to perhaps identify and apply new skills in their day-to-day working. Yes, I'd say it's a bit more of the former than the latter.
And you mentioned two things there, project management and change management. I think project management is perhaps something that firms, lawyers are a little bit more familiar with. What are the differences between the two? And can you have one without the other? Are they one in the same? Tell us more.
They are different, but they work very, very closely together. I'd say that project management is really much more focused on the tactical delivery. So typically to execute a good project or to deliver a successful project, you want to ensure that things are being done on time, within budget, and with the right resources being allocated to that specific project. Whereas change management is really around the impact and the behavioral change that you see off the back of that project that's being delivered. So I think you probably can have one without the other, but I think if you were focusing on change management, it pays to be organized as well, because obviously in order to deliver the change, you need things happening within certain timeframes, and you don't want project drift. The business isn't going to accept if a project never gets delivered, for example. And equally, you can get project managers that do have an eye on things like what they need to be communicating out, what's the knowledge impact, etc. So I think it's a bit of a blurring of skills in some respect, but it is they are two quite different specialisms. And then within the team that we have here, we also have business analysts that sit in there as well, and they spend a lot of time designing the changes, designing the projects, looking at use case scenarios, etc. And that's quite another interesting component to successful project and change delivery.
You're obviously in a bigger firm, and so the firm has the luxury of you and your team and a range of specialists. But I think, across the range of firms of different sizes, there are always projects that come up that require individuals to have new skills, to that will have an impact on the individuals that are working in the firm. So I don't know if you can share with us either, the model that perhaps you go through when you're thinking about a change project, or some tips for people who perhaps don't have a change management team. What should they be thinking about when they're trying to implement a change in their firms?
Yeah. So personally, I actually really like John Kotter's change management model. It was a model that I came across in my MBA. One of my subjects I did was around change management. He sort of breaks change management down into 8 steps, but it's the earlier steps in his model that I particularly like. So he sort of talks about that you need to create this sense of urgency, and that can either come through sort of burning platform, tends to be the phrase that people will throw out there in the context of creating urgency. But actually the other way of looking at that is you can also have a burning ambition. So it doesn't have to be negative. It can be positive, a positive sense of urgency and energy and a need for transformation. So he sort of talks about you need to have this urgency that's sitting within and around the business to want to change things. The second step he then draws on is that you need to build a coalition, which is essentially, I think, in the day-to-day running of organizations will be things like committees, group of stakeholders, getting your leadership on board with whatever that change is that you want to deliver. So he sort of talks about the need to have this coalition, because you can't really just have one person that's driving change through the organization unless it's an organization of 1 or 2 people. That's not going to be successful. And then he sort of talks about if you have the coalition in place, then actually you create this vision for success. So you're clear on what you're trying to achieve with your change. And then he sort of moves into, communicating the vision, removing the obstacles. So if, for example, that people won't look to transition their behaviors or do things differently because there's nothing in it for them, that's sort of the what's in it for me factor, then you need to deal with that. You can't just continue to have those obstacles in the way, because that's going to impact what you're doing in terms of your change plans. And then he talks about things like quick wins, creating these short-term achievements, build on the change, and then sort of institutionalize the change. So it's quite a linear model, which in academic circles, people sort of say perhaps that's not really how real change works, but actually I like it because it's easy to follow. It focuses on the buy-in for change, and it's quite simple. So that's definitely one, I think, through any project lens that I'm looking at. There's lots of other models out there, but I always come back to Kotter's model because I think it works for me in terms of clarifying my thinking about what I'm trying to do.
And you mentioned at the beginning, and I said I'd come back to it, that you've not had the most traditional route into change management. So I'm going to ask you a question from 2 lenses, really. One is, how have you benefited from that non-traditional path? What does that bring to you in the role that you're doing? But also the other way round, is there anything that you wish you would have known from your current role in roles that you've had previously?
So I think on your first question, I think I would say that that's probably been, since I came through a route of marketing, I understand the importance of good, clear communication. I think that's sort of the benefit I've seen on that. So coming back to Kotter, he sort of talks about creating and communicating the vision as an important part of change management. And actually, I think a lot of change, there's an important role around skills development and learning. But for me, I think communication is really fundamental. If people understand what you're asking of them as the first step, then that's often part of the battle. So I think having come through a sort of marketing career path, I think that's been useful. So I'd say that's something that's helped in terms of delivering effective change management. I think the other thing I'd say is then also having spent a long time working in client management and business development. That's obviously looking at what's going on outside of the organization. So I'm, spend a lot of time thinking about impact on users and impact on clients. And I think a lot of work around change management tends to typically be internal, and that's what I like about that's what I like about it, and I find that quite interesting, having spent a lot of my career looking externally. But I think that ability to look externally means that I can be more effective, when it comes to looking at what you're doing from a change management position, because ultimately, if you're driving change through a business, you want it to have a positive impact on your profit, you want it to have a positive impact on your employees, you want it to have a positive impact on your client experience. So I think that's probably been helpful. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, I guess I tend to come at it as well with quite a good sort of commercial understanding and just good general business sense. And I think that's always quite a useful skill to have in anything that you're doing.
And the reverse question, so is there anything that you wish you had known from the role that you've currently got when you were in some of those previous roles?
Yeah, so I definitely think that when I went into JLL to deliver on the client management program, I delivered a client management program, and I didn't really have any true sense then of change management. And I think I would have done majority of things the same way, but perhaps put more emphasis on building that coalition that I talked about and creating the vision. So I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and there probably is a lot of things that I would have done differently knowing what I know now. But that's probably the most obvious one that I would draw out as a specific example.
So one of the things that you've mentioned a lot, and it's really the focus of this series, is skills.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been talking a little bit about kind of skills that you have learned and picked up. Thinking about lawyers or professionals more generally, because I know that you've covered professional services more generally, what skills do you think are key when we think about change?
I think that this is perhaps not a skill but a mantra, but the one thing about change is that it's constant. And I think people recognize that now. COVID, hybrid working, digital transformation, things are constantly evolving and adapting. I think that's an important self-realization, I guess. Having a growth mindset, I think, so that you're open-minded to different ways of doing things, I think is important. I think resilience and adaptability. Change is difficult. Humans generally don't like it, but I think that's not helped by if you are quite stuck in your ways, and if you are a traditionalist, I think that can make the journey even harder for you. I think having a kind of commitment to learning, and if you're curious by nature, that's probably also quite helpful, because you by virtue of that, you probably will have a slightly more open mind. You're constantly asking questions and looking to do things differently. But I think, the reality is change is hard, and it's emotional, and it's very individual for everybody. So my experience of transitioning to hybrid work, for example, is going to be extremely different to somebody else's. And everyone will go on the same sort of emotional journey, but they'll go on at a different speed. And I think it's probably realizing that some people there are a small percentage of people that you speak to that say things like, I love change, I love doing things differently all the time, but they're absolutely in the minority. The majority of people tend to, by nature, resist trying to do things differently. It's quite difficult in the beginning, and then at some point you transition across and you're familiar with what you're doing. I think they're probably the skills that I'd say that any professional or any human being probably needs to navigate any sort of sense of change.
And you mentioned a couple of those big changes, so hybrid working is a really good example of that. Do you think that, I guess, kind of reflecting back on the last 2 years where there's been huge change, obviously change that's been forced rather than one that's been able to be meticulously planned, what has that meant for you in your role? Has it made your role easier? Has it made it more difficult?
I think it has made people realize sort of the art of the possible. So if you look at, for example, the transition attached to COVID, the move, instantaneously, pretty much for most organizations to have to work from home, to get used to new systems like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, etc. People made that transition. Yes, it was forced and it wasn't anything that anybody planned for, but most organizations are now working in a new way using different platforms. There's been a lot of digital transformation off the back of that. But I think certainly what I would say from that is it's a really good example of the fact that it is possible. It is possible literally overnight to go away and do something completely differently. I mean, it's that sense of urgency, I guess. If you come back to Kotter's model, it absolutely was an urgent position. You went from sort of step 1 in his model to step 8 almost overnight. But I think it's definitely made people realize that it is entirely possible if it's not meticulously planned to achieve that sort of level of change. And I think that's quite exciting. The other thing is that I read an article recently, and I can't remember if it was an academic reference or a white paper from someone like McKinsey, but they did essentially say that actually if individuals, and by extension of that organizations, are going through significant levels of change, then actually that's a good time to push change through. So if people are transitioning to hybrid work, it's also a good time to introduce perhaps a new digital platform. There's a limit on how much individuals will take, and you need to be very aware of that impact on the end user and have an eye on that. And that's an important part of change management as well. But definitely, I think if you're looking at a really big transformational change, it is a good opportunity to perhaps slip in a few smaller changes around the edges as well.
And what do you think people have learned over the past 2 years around change?
I think that people have learned that humans are adaptable and a lot more resilient than perhaps I don't know, we gave ourselves credit for. I think also people have probably learned how individual that journey is, and that it's emotional and it's challenging, and you have ups and downs that come with change. But I'm not convinced that that's anything that people have learned that we maybe didn't already know. I guess it's just made that more obvious or highlighted it in a more extreme way, off the back of sort of transitioning to hybrid working, agile working, etc., that's come with something like COVID. But some people have had really awful experiences, and some people have had, I guess, more fulfilling experiences. So I don't think you can apply one broad learning for everybody. I think it's been a very independent journey that everyone's been on and is continuing to go on. We're not there yet with any of the new normal that people talk about, but yeah, I think it's probably just held a mirror up to the fact that we can definitely learn to do things differently.
I want to ask a kind of one more question, which hopefully will leave listeners with some takeaways, and that is reflecting on the different projects that you've managed, the different changes that you've had to navigate through. Either are there any challenges that you see again and again, and how do you manage those? Perhaps there's one really big challenge that stands out for you, and you could share that with us and how you perhaps navigated through it.
I think that there's probably two takeaways or two sort of actionable things that I would point to. Number one is that if you are looking at doing any sort of project or program or introducing something new within an organization, then I think it's important to really consider who your sponsor is for that and who is ultimately supporting the change. I think that's a really important element to be very aware of, and then linked to that, sort of what your stakeholder map, your internal stakeholder map looks like. I think that that's also an important step to work through if you are looking to deliver a project or a program that sits around change. And I think also within that, it's also then the importance of your sort of middle management line managers as well, because often in organizations, no matter if they're global or if they're national or local organizations, you'll have levels within your organization and that stakeholder mapping. And then within that, I think that sort of middle management group of employees is really important, because they're ultimately the ones that are delivering the messages on behalf of leadership into the wider organization. I think as I've navigated lots of kind of project and program delivery. That's definitely something that I've got more familiar with and more experienced with, and I'm much more aware of now when I look to implement transformational programs or change activities that perhaps when I was a little less experienced, wasn't spending as much time on. I think that is a really important step not to be overlooked.
And kind of the question that I'm sure, with marketing background hat on, we're probably similar to you. And there's always the partner who, doesn't want to buy into the change or has really good reasons why the change isn't necessary. How do you deal with that one?
I think it depends on why they're resisting the change, but I think it's important to understand what's the driver behind that. And then, and sometimes that's quite an awkward or difficult conversation that someone needs to have with them to recognize, what is it that they're not happy about. I think, the thing that's attached to that is it's not personal. It's not you that they're unhappy with necessarily, it's the change that they're being asked to introduce. But I think also it's important to remember that, because this job can be quite challenging at times, and I think if you take it all personally, you never get anything done. But I think that it's really important to have a conversation with them to understand, what's the issue, and then offer support in whatever form that takes. Perhaps it might be one-to-one training and guidance. Perhaps it is ensuring that there is one-to-one communications and messaging going into them. Perhaps you need to remove a specific obstacle that's standing in the way of them achieving or delivering on the change that you're after. But I think it's really just having some empathy, getting to the bottom of what's driving their resistance, and then trying to work with them and support them to unlock that.
I love that message around it's not personal. I think that's, for me, probably one of the things that took me the longest time to realise. But actually, I think when you get there and you realise, actually, this isn't personal to me. It's about the change, or it's about what's happening. That it does definitely makes things easier.
Yeah, for sure. I think you need a thick skin if you're trying to push any form of transformation, and a lot of energy.
So Anna, I think that's a really nice place to leave the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and wish you all the best in your new role.
Thanks, Claire. It's been a pleasure.
And Claire's with me now. Claire, what are your reflections on that conversation?
I think one of the things that was interesting when I was talking to Anna, and obviously Anna's role is very much thinking about change through an organisational lens. But a couple of times she picked up on this idea of change being individual, and everyone comes at change differently. And I think Ollie, you'll have some reflections as well as a coach. I think that often when people come to seek coaching, it is very much around change and about that individual journey that people go on.
I think that's right, and I think everybody, particularly when organisations change, need to find their own path through that.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting because, and again, it's something that Anna reflected on in terms of, since COVID, since the pandemic, it seems to be one change after another. And, she reflected there that sometimes actually when it's a period of change, that it's a good time to push other changes through. But I think, I wonder whether organisations think about change at an organisational level and sometimes forget about the impact that it has on individuals, and perhaps there are ways that organisations can make it easier for perhaps those individuals who struggle a bit more with change.
I think that's right, and maybe having somebody with Anna's skills will really help. And also, I was impressed how she can bring that optimism that, look, so many of us have gone through that change, that it really is possible and it can be positive for all of us. So, that expertise, can be a really useful thing in an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, obviously RPC are lucky to have Anna and lucky to have a team that are focused on change. And I think most organisations or smaller organisations won't have a team that perhaps is dedicated to change management. But I think, there were some really useful tips in that podcast about how firms might navigate change without a team. And I think that, for me, the one thing that I would encourage firms to look at is, yes, think about what is needed from a firm perspective, but make sure you don't forget the individual, and make sure you go out and ask and you listen and find out what the impact is on the individuals within the firm, and help bring them on board and come along the journey with you.
Thanks for that, Claire. That was a fascinating conversation. In the next episode of The Lawyer's Coach, I'm speaking to Sarah McCarthy, Chief Legal Officer at dunnhumby. Sarah and I talk about the key behaviours that make a relationship between a lawyer and their client work. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Lawyer's Coach is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. If you're enjoying this series, please rate us on your podcast provider so that others can find us. If you're a lawyer and would like to take part in Lawyer's Coach, please visit our website lawyercoach.co.uk for further details. And you can also join the conversation on our LinkedIn group Lawyer's Coach. If there are any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, then just get in touch.